Hello everyone, my name is Chad and we're going to talk about TE and TI and why they're both important to today's society. TE seeks to form conclusions from objects in the environment or logic in the environment, whether a fact is incoming or they're picking up a fact. They parse these facts. There's no interrelated logic in between each fact. For example, I'm going to use a mathematical example here. If A equals B equals C, then we know that A plus B plus C equals 3C. And so a TE user is more likely to discard the whole A equals B equals C function because now I've just built it. TE's function is about building. It's like making things, it's structuring things in the external. So we're going to use 3C now, and where can we use 3C to make it even better? If I take 3C and take 3 of those, that'd be 9C. So the point is, we're looking for building things in the environment and building upon that logic. But each logic for a TE user is separate from each other. So I may have a logic for building a house that is over here, and a logic for mathematics over here, and a logic for science over here, and a logic for and there's really no relationship between them. This is where TE can be weak, because they fail to draw relationships between them. Like in my brain, they're all separate. I'm a very dominant TE user, so I don't create relationships between all the external logic. They're all just in their own section in my brain as different things. There's no interrelated web. It's just things I've modified in the environment. Where this gets tough and interesting is where TE users have to build forward. They build things forward, and they have to modify the environment for it to make logical sense, because it creates stress for a TE user when the environment is unstructured, because it's not logical. Unless the TE is lower on the scale, then it's not as much a cumbersome task. But if TE is high on the upper scale, things have to be organized. We have an internal consistency with logic, usually guided by FI, that makes the environment important to structure and order. On the other hand, you take, we'll get to TI in a minute, never mind. So TE can basically forget the principles of what built that construction. So in the sense of A equals B equals C, and it formed 3C based on a conclusion of A plus B plus C, we would forget all the A's and the B's. We would just stick with 3C, and we can use 3C for this. So sometimes TE users don't have all the details to have that conclusion. We've just formed that conclusion and discarded the rest. We find it simpler and easier to use the conclusion. So once we get it, we're done with the details. We got the conclusion, we got the number, and we're going to build upon that versus sticking with the details and the facts that actually formed the conclusion. So it's very inductive. TE also has to modify and structure that environment to make that logic and make things logical. That's why TE users seek control. Dominant TE users have to control things because it clashes with their internal sense of logic. If something is not logical, they feel they need to structure it to make it logical because it may clash with their internal values. They have to make sense of it logically and make logical sense of the external world. On the other hand, TI is fascinating because TI seeks to proof the external conclusions with the building blocks of the internal logical framework that they've created. Everything is related in a TI's brain, or the TI user's brain. External facts that are incoming, they pick up on a fact. They have to fit the internal logical framework that the TI user has built for themselves. So what a TE user does in the environment, moving and organizing and creating logic in the external, the TI user is doing in their head. So the external is not important to them. In fact, most TI users like chaotic because it tends to open possibilities. That's why usually dominant TI users can be, and they are, perceiving types versus judging types, because they're more open with receiving new information that allows them to expand their logical network or their logical framework. They do a checks and balances system. Excuse me, real quick. They do a checks and balances system that essentially any incoming fact has to be cross-referenced with their framework, the logic that they've built upon over the years of their life. And that is why TI users take longer to learn things, because the fact is running through a system of algorithms if it passes or fails inside their brain. So if I say A equals B and B equals C, but they have learned in the past that A equals 3 and B equals 3, but C equals 4, they're going to figure out, they're going to run that fact, that conclusion through their logical framework, and if they find that it's false, then they will discard it. They will say it's false. So the word I like to use for TI users is truth-seeking, because they really do seek ultimate truth and logical consistency among all things. So everything's interrelated. Unlike a TE user, we have our separate logic that's not necessarily related. So what may be true for one thing is not true for another. A TI user has to find that they're all consistent. And so they run them through a ton of mental algorithms, typically making TI users very analytical. And they can break things down and find out how they fit in the large puzzle that's their logical framework in their head. So TI seeks to find consistency in all these facts. And any incoming fact must be validated through that network. And if they find that it can't fit, but yet it's proven as true, a TI user can be relentless in looking for where it does fit, to the point where a TI user will drive themselves crazy until they find out where it fits. It's important that the TI user does this, because they can't live with an illogical inconsistency just like the TE user can. They have trouble living with that inconsistency. But it doesn't have to be external. It's all internal. It has to fit into their internal logical framework. The external is the TE user. So in reality, it's like they do the same thing, but it's flipped. One's inside the mind and one is external. TE users, we have to make things very, we have to move and structure externally. That's how we find consistency within ourselves. On the other hand, the TI user, they have to scale it. They have to create a logical consistency in their head to make essentially their extroverted feeling governs that, especially the INTP part, where that has to make logical sense, so that way the world can be a better place in a generalized statement, or creating harmony among people, because there's only one universal truth. And TI users are believers in absolute truth more than, say, TE users who believe things can change on a dime and the circumstances, logic can change. So I'm not going to say either one of those are true or false. I'm just saying that's their standard frame of reference. And of course they each can find that they're going to change their logical framework externally or internally if they find a fact discrepancy. The difference between these two is TI users have sections for every fact and every detail. They will remember the A equals B equals C, and also they will remember a 3C, and they will remember A plus B plus C, and they store all these away. Versus a TE user who wants to be move forward faster. They want to move forward faster. So we're going to remember what words we need to use that express what we think, and then we move forward past it. A TI user has a little like a toolbox in their brain for every single logical fact, so they typically have very large, profound vocabularies, and they know how to use every word, and they know how to express the word better than TE users. TE users typically, we pick one word, and that's the word we use a lot, because we feel like it does the job. And we find the word that's better, in the sense the word that works for us, and it may not be more descriptive, but it fits the puzzle generally, and we want to move past it. A TI user wants to make sure that the details are consistent and logical. And so the logic is different, but there's no better or worse. And I think both TI and TE need each other. TI can get wound up in the details, spending countless hours trying to sort out this logical inconsistency, while the TE user has already built 4 houses, or built a hotel, and built his businesses, while the TI user is still trying to figure out if the wood is better than the stone, and or what they should use. So TI takes longer to process and process information. The problem I have with it is that society deems TI users as dumb, and typically, or they don't fit in or whatever, and they don't. It's true. The society's made for TE users, but they're not dumb. TI users actually, in my opinion, may be more logical than TE users in the sense of truth-seeking. TI users will generally nail down what they believe ultimately is the truth. TE users only care about the truth that moves them forward, and they will change their truths. TE users, we discard our logic fast if someone can prove otherwise, and we don't hold on to it because it's all in the external environment. You put us from one environment to another environment, we're going to use a whole new type of logic. A TI user is going to have that consistent logic, and should they be challenged, they're going to hang on to it more, just like they hang on to details more. They'll remember more in the sense of logic and why they're deductive. TI users are deductive. They want to make sure that all the pieces fit. So it's all stored here in their brain. Anyway, that is the difference between the two. I'd like to go into FE and FI and how they function with that, but I frankly just don't have enough time, so we're going to stick with TI and TE and the differences. And so just understand that, in a summary, the TI user has a logical framework inside their head, and it has to be, all incoming facts have to be consistent with that logical framework. Everything is interrelated. Every piece of logic is interrelated. And if it's not, they're going to draw a map to find a way to get it interrelated. Hence why they're called I call them the truth seekers. They're also the analytical people. And they're also the theoretical, because they explore the unknown more than a TE user would. On the other hand, TE users, we have to modify our environment, and we seek control externally to make sure that it's consistent with our logical framework that we've constructed in the environment. It has to be consistent with our internal values, and we are generally fast to learn, but we disregard the building blocks of things. We typically take the end result and move it forward, and so we're very forward driven, and that's an inductive logic. And we're fast to learn. We're easy to disregard facts and move forward. We learn all the details to figure something out. Once we figure it out, we forget all the details, and then we remember the conclusion. And that's what's more important, is the conclusion for a TE user. So we disregard facts, and we're the practical type versus the theoretical. A lot of us we apply it. It's external. It's here, so it tends to be a little more practical. It's applicable, and it also is, the TE user is more what I call a builder or a structurer, creating order externally outside of their head to create logical consistency. So basically they do the same thing, both TI and TE, it's just reversed. One's inside the brain, TI, one's outside the brain, TE. So the balance is important, and I think as a society we need both types. Anyway, that's TI versus TE. If you have any questions, feel free to comment.